on a gray Thursday morning in October of 1817. The Charac Gazette printed an auction notice that would be remembered in the district for a generation. It listed, in the precise language of financial despair, the contents of Strelton Hall, 112 acres of parkland, the house itself with all its furnishings, the stables, the carriage and four, the cellar wines, the library. At the bottom, in smaller type, it listed the household staff being released without character references. Anne Morrow, Governess, plain, of uncertain reliability, no family to recommend her. The woman who read that notice was standing in the Strelton Hall kitchen when the cook set the Gazette on the table. Her name was not Anne Morrow. It had never been Anne Morrow. Her name was Araminta Strelton, and Strelton Hall was her home, and she had been living in it for 3 years under a false name because a forged will and a dead father had left her with no other way in. She read the notice twice. She did not cry. She had not cried since the morning she buried her father, and she had decided, somewhere in the long cold months that followed, that tears were a thing she could not afford. But her hands, when she folded the Gazette and set it back on the table, were not entirely steady. Before the week was out, 17 letters would arrive at Strelton Hall. Not one of them would ask about the library. Not one of them would ask about the parkland. Every one of them would ask, in language ranging from polite to something considerably less so, who in God's name had put the name of Captain Bowen Strelton's daughter in the public papers and called her unreliable. But to understand that morning in October, one must go back 3 years. To the month, the news came from the Atlantic. Araminta Strelton had been 21 years old when the naval messenger arrived at Strelton Hall. Her father, Captain Bowen Strelton, had died of burns sustained aboard the corvette Endeavour 6 weeks after leading 43 men off a burning gun deck through smoke so thick his officers said they could not see their own hands in front of them. He had gone back twice for men who could not walk. He had been the last person off the ship. By then his uniform was on fire. The messenger was kind. He offered her the Navy's condolences and a small pension that would not have kept a dog in comfort. He did not mention the second letter already on its way from a solicitor in Halifax. Her uncle Bertrand arrived a fortnight after the funeral. He brought lawyers, a great deal of luggage, and his wife, Lady Felicia, who moved through the rooms of Strelton Hall with the measuring eye of a woman taking inventory. Within 3 days, a will had been produced. It named Bertrand Strelton sole heir to the estate. Araminta, it said, had been provided for by an arrangement with a family in Edinburgh. There was no arrangement with a family in Edinburgh. There had never been any such arrangement, and the signature on that will, which Araminta had stared at for an hour in the solicitor's office, had something wrong about it. Something in the slant of the letters, something in the pressure of the pen. She could not have stood before a judge and said exactly what was wrong. She only knew that her father, who had written her letters every month since she was 7, had never once in his life formed the letter R in that particular way. She was 21, with no money, no powerful connections, and no proof. Bertrand was in possession of the estate and the lawyers. She was not in a position to fight him. She was, however, in a position to think. It took her 2 months to construct Anne Morrow. She found a position advertised in a county newspaper. Governess wanted, Strelton Hall, apply in writing. She applied in careful, plain prose. She was hired by Lady Felicia, who met her at the door and looked directly through her without a trace of recognition. 3 years ago, Araminta had been a girl of 21 in mourning black. Anne Morrow was 24, wore gray, had her hair pinned differently, and kept her eyes down. That was enough. Lady Felicia had no imagination for people she considered beneath her. Only one person in Strelton Hall had recognized her at once. Mrs. Garnett, who had been housekeeper since before Araminta was born, had opened the kitchen door on Anne Morrow's first morning and gone absolutely still. Then the old woman had looked at her steadily for a long moment, turned away, and never once said a word about it to anyone. For 3 years, Araminta taught her uncle's children their sums and their French verbs, and in the evenings, when the household was quiet, she searched every drawer, every cabinet, every locked room to which she could find or copy a key. She was looking for the original will, or for evidence of how the false one had come to be made. She found nothing. Lady Felicia was thorough. What she did not know was that Mrs. Garnett had found what she was looking for on the second week of Bertrand's arrival, when the old housekeeper came upon Lady Felicia feeding papers to the study fireplace at 1 in the morning. Mrs. Garnett had retrieved a fragment before the fire took it completely. She had kept it for 3 years in the false bottom of a tea caddy, not knowing what to do with it, waiting for someone to ask. No one had asked until now. The Duke of Caldonmore arrived in the district in September, 6 weeks before the auction notice. He had inherited his title unexpectedly from an uncle, and had come to understand what he had inherited. Jasper Holwick was 34, dark-haired, and not unkind, though he gave that impression at first because he was precise and quiet and had a habit of looking at things long and carefully before speaking. He had ledgers, several of them. He rode the boundaries of the neighboring property with the focused attention of a man who has a great deal to repair and is not certain where to start. He came to call at Strelton Hall because that was what neighbors did, and because he had heard in the village that the estate was likely to go to auction. He sat in the drawing-room with Bertrand, who talked too much, and Lady Felicia, who smiled with great skill and drank tea he did not particularly want. On his way out through the entrance hall, he nearly walked into a woman in gray carrying a stack of school books. She stepped aside without looking up. He stepped aside at the same moment, in the same direction, and there was that small collision of intention that happens when two people move at once. He caught the books before they fell. She looked up to thank him, and for half a moment, her eyes met his directly before she looked down again, and he was left with an impression he could not have explained. That whatever this woman was pretending to be, she was something considerably more. "I beg your pardon," she said in a voice that had been trained to be colorless. "Anne Morrow, the governess." "Jasper Holwick," he said, and then, because it seemed absurd to give her only his name when she had given hers with a job title attached, "the new Duke, though that description fits rather poorly still." She almost smiled. Then she didn't. She took the books back, thanked him, and went upstairs without another word. He thought about that almost smile for longer than was reasonable. The auction notice appeared on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, the first letter arrived at Strelton Hall. By Saturday, 7 more. By the following Wednesday, the hall table was buried under correspondence, and the post-rider had begun to look alarmed. Every letter asked about the same thing, not the parkland, not the library. Every one of them asked about the dismissal of Anne Morrow, governess, and they were written in the kind of confident, decisive handwriting that belongs to men who are accustomed to being obeyed. Lady Felicia read the first 3 and told Bertrand they were nothing, a mistake, someone playing a joke. She told herself the same thing and did not believe it. The morning the carriages started coming up the drive, she stopped telling herself anything at all. They came in naval uniform, mostly. Some were gray-haired. Some were not much older than 40. They came from Halifax and from London, and from a posting in the Caribbean, one man having sailed for 3 weeks upon reading the notice in an overseas dispatch. Rear Admiral Lord Carston came first, in a carriage that bore a flag Bertrand Strelton recognized with a sudden, cold-dropping sensation in his chest. He received them in the drawing-room. Lady Felicia sat beside him with a smile that did not waver, which Araminta, watching from the doorway of the schoolroom landing, thought was an impressive piece of work. Rear Admiral Lord Carston was 63 years old, white-haired, and had the bearing of a man who had survived things that most people do not survive, and had been quietly shaped by that survival into something very difficult to move. He did not sit down. He stood in the center of the drawing room and looked at Bertrand Strelton for a long moment, and then said, in a conversational tone, "Where is she?" "I beg your pardon?" Bertrand said. "Your notice describes a woman dismissed without character. The name given is Anne Morrow." Lord Carston set the auction notice on the table between them, smoothed it flat with one hand. "I have served in His Majesty's Navy for 41 years, Mr. Strelton. I know how to read an inventory. That name is not in that list by accident, and it is not there without cost to someone. I am asking you, for the last time politely, where she is." Lady Felicia opened her mouth. Her husband put his hand on her arm. From the landing above, Araminta heard her own heartbeat very clearly. She had spent 3 years being quiet, being careful, being invisible. She had spent 3 years waiting for something she could not have named. The right moment, the right evidence, the right intervention from a world that had, up until now, not particularly noticed she was gone. She thought of Mrs. Garnett, who had looked at her on that first morning and said nothing, and who had kept something she had not yet shown anyone. She thought of a governess's cap and 3 years of gray dresses. She thought of the auction notice with her own name in it, listed plain and unreliable, beneath the entry for the wine cellar. She went downstairs. She did not change her dress. She did not remove the governess's cap. She walked into the drawing room with it still on, which was either the most undignified or the most useful thing she had ever done, because it meant that when Rear Admiral Lord Carston turned to look at her, he saw exactly what they had made of her, and his face went the color of old paper. "Lord Carston," she said, "I am Anne Morrow. I am also Araminta Strelton. I have been both at once for 3 years, because my father left a will that someone found inconvenient, and I had no other way into this house." The silence that followed was the longest Araminta had ever stood inside. "Your father," Lord Carston said very quietly, "had gray eyes." "Yes." "And a scar along his left jaw from a splinter at the Battle of the Nile." Araminta touched her own jaw, the same place. "He used to tell me it was a dueling scar. My mother said that was nonsense. He'd got it in the Navy, and he'd say yes, but dueling sounded better." Lord Carston crossed the room in 4 steps and took both her hands, and this large, white-haired man who had commanded ships and men and battles looked at her face the way a man looks at something he thought he had lost and had not entirely allowed himself to hope for. "Merciful God," he said, "Bowen's girl, we have been looking for you for 3 years." They gathered in the library because Lord Carston refused to speak anywhere else. "This is still her house," he said to Bertrand, who had the sense not to argue. "We will speak in its best room." So the library was opened, and chairs were brought, and Araminta sat for the first time in 3 years in a room of Strelton Hall, without a stack of schoolbooks in her arms, while the men who had come for her filled the spaces around the walls, 6 of them now, more still on the road. Lord Carston told the story standing, the way men tell things they have rehearsed many times and still cannot make short enough. In the last year of the war, he said, a merchant convoy had been escorting relief supplies through the Atlantic when a French raider caught them in fog. One ship took a cannon shot to the powder magazine. The fire spread faster than anyone had planned for. The captain of escort, that was Captain Bowen Strelton, who had no reason to do what he did next, who had his own ship and his own crew to think of, came alongside and held position in burning seas long enough for 43 men to cross. He had directed the evacuation from the burning deck himself, pushing men across, going back for the ones who couldn't move on their own. The fire had reached him before the last man was over the side. He came across last, Lord Carston said, both arms burned to the elbow. He managed to give the order to pull clear before he lost consciousness. The old man's voice was steady. It was the steadiness of something that has been held in check for a very long time. He lingered 6 weeks in Halifax. We sat with him, those of us who could be spared. He asked after you, near the end. He called you Minta, and he said he had a letter for you. Something lodged with the solicitor's office, and that you were to have everything, all of it, because you were worth every timber in that house. The room was quiet. Someone near the door was making no effort to conceal that they were weeping. 9 of us were on that convoy, Lord Carston said. 9 of us owe him our lives, 3 more who knew him from other service. When we came home, we looked for his daughter. We were told she had gone to relatives in Edinburgh. He looked at Araminta steadily. There are no relatives in Edinburgh. No, she said, there aren't. He looked then, slowly, at Bertrand Strelton, who was standing by the window. The look on the rear admiral's face required no elaboration. Mr. Strelton, said Lord Carston, with extraordinary quietness. 12 men are prepared to swear before any court in this country that they owe their lives to your brother. They are prepared to spend whatever is required of them in time, in money, and in public attention to see his daughter recognized as the heir of this estate. I recommend you consider very carefully what you intend to say next. It was Mrs. Garnett who settled it. She came in from the hall while Bertrand was still saying nothing in particular, and she set a tea caddy on the library table, and she opened the false bottom, and she laid out a fragment of paper that had been very nearly burned. It was enough. Half a page of a will, in the hand of the same Halifax solicitor who had drawn up the forged document, signed and dated 2 weeks before Captain Bowen Strelton's death. The surviving half named Araminta Strelton as sole heir. Lady Felicia's name appeared nowhere in it. I found it in the fire, Mrs. Garnett said to the room at large, in the voice of a woman who has been waiting 3 years to say a thing and is now saying it with great precision. She was burning it. I took what I could. Lady Felicia said nothing. She had been saying nothing for several minutes, and she had, Araminta thought, the look of someone calculating whether there is any sum left that comes out in their favor, and finding that there isn't. The Duke of Caldonmore had not been in the library for most of this. He had arrived at Strelton Hall an hour into the gathering, having heard from 3 different sources that something significant was occurring, and had been told by the footman that the library was full and that he might wait in the hall. He had waited in the hall, and then he had not waited in the hall, and now he was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand, listening to Mrs. Garnett, and his face was difficult to read except for one thing. Whatever he was feeling, it was not surprise. He had suspected something for some time, perhaps since the day in the entrance hall with the school books. Precise men notice things. The legal proceedings that followed took 11 days and were, by the account of Mr. Polhurst, the Halifax solicitor, who arrived on day 4 with the original registration of the will, the most straightforward estate recovery robbery he had conducted in 40 years of practice, on account of how many naval officers were present to provide testimony, and how completely Lady Felicia had stopped speaking. Bertrand left Strelton Hall on the 12th day. Lady Felicia left the same morning in a separate carriage, which is a detail that requires no further comment. The 12 naval officers, by unspoken agreement, let it be known in London and Halifax and every port city between them exactly what had occurred at Strelton Hall, and the doors that closed after that closed quietly and did not open again. Araminta took possession of Strelton Hall on a cold morning in November, wearing the same gray governess's dress because she had not yet had time to arrange anything else, and with the governess's cap still in her hand because she had taken it off in the library and had not quite known where to put it. Mrs. Garnett opened the front door and said, "Welcome home, Miss Strelton," and then burst into tears in a manner entirely inconsistent with 40 years of professional composure. The first thing Araminta did was find every member of the staff and learn, or relearn, their names. She already knew most of them. She had been eating in the kitchen with them for 3 years. The second thing she did was have the forged will framed. Not the original. That went to the solicitor's archive, but the forgery, the false document that had taken her home from her and turned her into a governess in her own house. She hung it in the library, directly opposite the desk. Her uncle had sat at that desk for 3 years. She sat at it now, and she could see the forgery from where she worked, and she intended to keep it there until she died, as a reminder that documents and names and legal language can be made to say nearly anything by someone with sufficient motive and insufficient conscience, and that the appropriate response is not despair, but method. The governess's cap she hung beside it. The 12 naval officers convened at Strelton Hall every year on the anniversary of the evacuation. They had no charter and no official standing. They simply came, and they argued with each other in the way that men who have been through things together argue. And they told stories about Captain Bowen Strelton. And Araminta listened and learned her father one conversation at a time, the way you learned someone who died before you knew how to pay attention. She had a portrait commissioned. It hung in the entrance hall, where the light was good. He had gray eyes, her father, and a scar along his left jaw, and a look of dry amusement that she recognized because she saw it in the mirror when she was thinking clearly. Mrs. Garnett was given the housekeeper's cottage at the edge of the grounds, with a pension and an open invitation to the kitchen, which she never refused. She lived there for 19 years and outlasted 3 of the 12 naval officers, which she considered appropriate. The Duke of Caldenmore remained at Caldenmore. He had his estate to repair and his ledgers to attend to, and he told himself on several occasions, no claim on the future of the Strelton heir. He had helped where he could help. He had done nothing remarkable. He had simply noticed, some time ago, that a woman who addressed servants by their names and quoted naval regulations accurately, when she thought no one was listening, was not a governess, and had begun to ask quiet questions, and had found Mr. Polhurst in Halifax before anyone had asked him to look. He had not mentioned this. There had not seemed to be a correct moment. In December, an item appeared in the Trewith Gazette. It was in the property notices column, between an advertisement for a tenant farmer and an announcement of a church repair fund. It read, "One parcel of land on the Caldenmore boundary, being the East Meadow and the watermill, purchased at fair price from the estate of the late previous Duke, and returned this day to its proper neighborhood. Considered long neglected, and now considerably improved. The purchaser invites no gratitude, but will accept a reasonable conversation over the fence when time permits. A. Strelton, Strelton Hall." The Duke read it in his study at 9 in the morning, read it again, and was at the East Meadow fence by 10. She was already there. She had her hands in her coat pockets against the cold, and was looking out at the mill race, which was not yet repaired but would be. And she heard him come across the grass, and did not look around. They stood on either side of the boundary fence for a moment, in the manner of people who have been working up to a conversation for some time, and are now slightly uncertain how to begin it. "You found Mr. Polhurst," she said. Not a question. She had worked it out some weeks ago, and had been deciding what to do with the knowledge. "Yes." Before Lord Carston arrived. "Several days before, yes." She looked at him. "You could have told me. You were still Anne Morrow at the time," he said. "I thought you might have a reason for that. I thought it wasn't mine to disrupt." He paused. "I may have been wrong. If I was wrong, I would like to know it." Araminta considered this for a moment. It was, she thought, an honest answer. She had received enough dishonest ones in 3 years to recognize the other kind when she heard it. "You weren't wrong," she said. "I needed to find it myself, the will, the proof, all of it. I needed to be the one who found it." She looked back at the mill raceway. "What I would have liked is to have known there was someone on the other side of the fence who was looking as well. It would have been a comfort." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There is someone on the other side of the fence who is looking. There has been for some time. If that is useful to you, it is yours." The east meadow was silver with frost. The mill race ran cold and quick over the stones. The Trewith Gazette had that morning printed exactly one notice that anyone in the district would remember. Araminta Strelton looked at the Duke of Caldenmore across the boundary fence of her own estate, and thought that 3 years of gray dresses had been, in the end, precisely adequate preparation for this moment, because she did not look away, and she did not soften what she said next. "Then stay," she said. "I have 17 rooms I don't know what to do with, and 1 solicitor who visits too often, and 12 naval officers who argue at dinner. I could use someone who notices things and doesn't say so immediately." He smiled then, properly, for what she believed was the first time she had seen it. "I can do that," the Duke of Caldenmore said. The fence between their estates was taken down the following spring. The east meadow bloomed in June. The mill ran again by August, and the miller, who had worked the same stones under the previous duke, came back from the village where he'd been waiting and said he had known someone would see sense eventually. The Trewith Gazette covered the wedding in October. In the library at Strelton Hall, behind the glass of a plain oak frame, the forge will still hangs opposite the desk. Beside it, on a small brass hook, is a governess's cap, faded now, the gray gone softer with the years. Visitors ask about them sometimes, and the Duchess of Caldenmore, who was once Anne Morrow and was always Araminta Strelton, tells them the same thing her father apparently told his officers the night before a crossing, that no one thought they would survive. "The only thing required of you is to be exactly who you are, in exactly the place you are, and not to pretend otherwise for anyone's comfort but your own." He was, by all accounts, very good at that. "She has been working on it."